yesterday, we finished up the lecture by saying that President Johnson was adamantly against the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, and because of his opposition, the radical Republicans in Congress set their sights on trying to remove him from office, and they tried to defame him early with rumors such as accusations that he was a drunkard while serving as President of the United States, and he was harboring a harem of loose women in the White House. Well, those don't constitute high crimes and misdemeanors to call for an impeachment hearing, and so to set President Johnson up in their impeachment plans, they passed a new law called the Tenure of Office Act of 1867. And this law was passed by Congress just to set him up because they knew that he wouldn't be able to abide by it. Now, in order to know whether he could abide by it or not, we have to know what it stated. And basically, it was a pretty simple law. The Tenure of Office Act stated that if a president was going to remove a member of his presidential cabinet, he had to get the approval of the Senate to do so. So if the president ever wanted to remove a member of his cabinet, then he had to get the permission of the Senate to do so. Now, Julie Warren, you think about that law. Why in the world would they pass a law like that? What would be their reasoning for passing a law that said if a president wants to get rid of a cabinet member, they have to get the Senate's approval? Why would they pass something like that?
I mean, you can't just go up and hire people.
Close. Close. Now they're setting him up. So if he can't just go out and fire people without their permission, evidently he must have been planning on firing someone. Now, do you remember when we talked about that person and I said keep that person in mind because we're going to talk about him later? Edwin Stanton. Do you remember the day Lincoln was assassinated? They had a cabinet meeting and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wanted to resign, and Lincoln asked him not to do it until after they got through this Reconstruction process, right? Well, when President Johnson took over for President Lincoln, he disliked Edwin Stanton immensely. He didn't trust him, and he had rights not to trust him because basically what Edwin Stanton did is anything Johnson disclosed in a cabinet meeting, he went back behind Johnson's back and told the radical Republicans what he was planning on doing. And the radical Republicans in Congress knew that he hated Stanton and probably would try to fire him soon. So they put this law in that stated that if he was going to fire any member of his presidential cabinet, he had to have the Senate's permission. And obviously, can you see where the setup's coming here? Well, Johnson was a hard-headed guy, and a lot of people are like that. If somebody passes a rule just to spite me, what is my natural reaction to that? I'm going to do it anyway, right? And Johnson didn't believe that the Tenure of Office Act was constitutional at all. So when he figured out that they passed this law just to tick him off or set him up, what did he do? He fired Edwin Stanton. Fired him. Okay? Knowing that he would not get the approval. So since President Johnson believed the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional, and he didn't like the fact that it was put in to set him up, he bowed his neck like people often do, and he fired Stanton anyway, without the Senate's approval. Well, how about that? Wasn't that exactly what the radical Republicans in Congress wanted him to do? Because now it gives them justification to begin impeachment proceedings against him. Okay? So, it's exactly what the radical Republicans are waiting for. It's going to give them the justification they need to start impeachment proceedings against Johnson. And because of his violation of the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, Johnson was accused of committing high crimes and misdemeanors by the radical Republicans in Congress, and actions now are going to go forward to impeach him and put him on trial before the Senate to try to get rid of him out of office. That's why the Tenure of Office Act is so important to understand. because it was done to set Johnson up for impeachment. And it did. Which takes us to our next subtopic then, which is the impeachment and the trial of Andrew Johnson. The impeachment and trial of Andrew Johnson. Now, we told you yesterday, right, that once a United States president has been impeached by the House, a trial is held, and who holds the trial? The Senate. They're like the jurors. Now, you have to have a judge. Whenever you have a trial, you have to have a judge, right? So, the other class had a little more difficulty with this, and we'll see if you do. Who do you think is going to preside as the judge in this trial since the Senate is running it? Who is the highest ranking legal officer in the nation? Say it. No, what are you going to say? I think you have it. No, what are you going to say? You're going to say Secretary of State?
No.
You're going to say Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's right.
Oh.
So who heads the Supreme Court? Who's the highest ranking member of the Supreme Court?
Is Marshall still there?
No, he's not there, but you got the name. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will preside over this trial. The other class took them forever. They never did figure it out. So that's very good. You were apprehensive. You didn't think you knew. You know way more than you think you know. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to be the one presiding over the trial. He's like the judge that's keeping order. Okay? Now, not long after Johnson fired Stanton, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him, and then he's going to go on trial by the Senate. And basically, who's the jury? The entire Senate. Now, a weird thing happened, though. Just before the trial started, a senator from Kansas by the name of Jim Lane committed suicide. Just before the trial. Didn't have anything to do with the trial. But he was a Republican senator from Kansas, a Republican senator from Kansas, and he committed suicide, that being Jim Lane, just before the trial. So what does the state of Kansas have to do once they lose a member of the Senate? They have to elect another one, and they elect him just to serve the rest of that man's term. And the man that they elected to replace Senator Jim Lane was Edmund G. Ross, a very important name in history. Edmund G. Ross would be the man that the citizens of Kansas would elect to replace Jim Lane, who committed suicide, and Ross will only serve out the remainder of Lane's term. Could he run again if he wanted to? Sure he could. But what he's been elected to is the rest of Lane's term, and it just so happens, kiddos, that what's he inherit right away? The opportunity to be involved in this impeachment trial of the President of the United States. Now, when the trial got over and concluded, the Senate basically voted on whether to remove Johnson or not. So, Senator Baumstark from Worland, how do you vote in the impeachment and trial of Andrew Johnson? You got one or two choices.
I can say either or.
Yeah? What are you going to say? Guilty or not guilty, right? So she says guilty. Okay, Senator Warren of Newcastle, so to speak, what is your verdict? Well, they go all the way through the Senate, and they get within one vote of 2/3 majority. One vote. And there's only one senator left to vote. And guess who that is? Edmund G. Ross. So, they take the Senate vote roll call, and they get all the way through the Senate, and they have one particular person left to vote, Edmund G. Ross, and it just so happens that his vote is going to make the difference in whether President Johnson survives or is removed from office. Now, I want you kiddos to think about this a little bit. This guy came in brand new. He is a Republican, okay? The political thing to do, the safe thing to do, would be to vote what? Guilty, because you know you're only going to tick off 1/3 of the people, right? You're going to make a lot of the people 2/3, so the Senate's going to think you're awesome, and the radical Republicans who could cause you damage are really going to think you're awesome. And they're expecting you to do that, right? So it gets all the way around and it comes to Edmund G. Ross, the new senator of Kansas. How do you vote? And you know what he says? Not guilty. He votes his conscience, not the political track. He votes not guilty. And when he votes not guilty, President Johnson now is allowed to complete his term, and his political career is saved. So as a result of Senator Ross's deciding vote, President Andrew Johnson remains in office until the end of his term. His political career saved. Yes?
So who would have been president if he had been kicked out of office?
That's a good question. They would have to go to probably Speaker of the House, because there was no Vice President. Yeah?
So if you get impeached once, can you get impeached again in the same president term?
You could. You'd have to go to trial. You could. Yeah, you could. Now, I mentioned this. As a result of Senator Ross's deciding vote, President Johnson remained in office until the end of his term. His political career saved. On the other side of the coin, after making his deciding vote, Senator Edmund Ross's political career was over. I mean, it was over. He served out the remainder of Lane's term. He moved back to Kansas. He lived out the rest of his life in obscurity, which means basically no one knows who you are or cares. And he dies in 1907. Okay? So Edmund G. Ross's career is over. He is chastised by the radical Republicans. He barely gets through the rest of Lane's term. He obviously has no shot to be reelected to his own term, or elected to his own term. He simply goes back to Kansas and falls in the deepest hole ever, so to speak, and dies in 1907. And no one will ever remember Edmund G. Ross again. True or false?
False.
False. Why?
Because you remember him?
Yep.
Oh,
What?
because he was the one that made the decision.
But in 1907 he dies, and I'm telling you, nobody gives a rat's rear end about him for the next 50 years, 49 years.
Okay.
49 years later, in 1956, 49 years after he dies, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts writes a Pulitzer Prize winning book entitled Profiles in Courage. This book gave John Kennedy the notoriety that he needed to eventually become President of the United States. He was a junior senator from Massachusetts. He wrote this book while recovering from back surgery. It turns out to win the Pulitzer Prize for literature. And this book is about 8 courageous Americans that did great things for our country. Here's some names in his book. John Quincy Adams. You don't have to write these down. Daniel Webster. Thomas Hart Benton. Familiar names? Sam Houston. Lucius Lamar. George Norris. Robert A. Taft. And Edmund G. Ross. 49 years later, John Kennedy redeems Edmund G. Ross of being one of 8 people in this country that showed such courageous actions that may have saved the Union. Now I'm going to read just a little bit of an excerpt out of this. And this is chapter 6, and it says, quote, "I looked down into my open grave." Edmund G. Ross. This is what it says. "In a lonely grave, forgotten and unknown, lies the man who saved a president, and who, as a result, may well have preserved for ourselves and posterity constitutional government in the United States. The man who performed in 1868 what one historian called the most heroic act in American history, incomparable, more difficult than any deed of valor upon the field of battle, but a United States Senator whose name no one recalls, Edmund G. Ross of Kansas." Kennedy was so impressed, and you guys brought this up, okay? Rhiannon said, who was going to be president if he was thrown out of office? It would have been a mess. It would have been an absolute mess. So what he's saying is Edmund G. Ross, rather than taking the political track to save his own career, voted his conscience and saved a presidency. And the presidency, kids, you need to understand, the presidency is not a person. It's an institution. It doesn't matter who the president is. It's the institution of the presidency that matters. And if they throw him out of office, Andrew Johnson, you have disrupted the presidency. You have messed up who's going to succeed him in a time in history when we could have least afforded it during Reconstruction. And so that's what Kennedy's point is this man saved government in the United States today. He knew they had set him up. He knew it wasn't right. And Kennedy acknowledged that Edmund G. Ross of Kansas, who nobody knew for 49 years, all of a sudden becomes a topic of a Pulitzer Prize winning book in 1956. It's pretty powerful when you think about it. Okay? One of the greatest men in history who no one ever knew who he was. Well, as a result of that, President Johnson, as I mentioned, will serve out the rest of his term quietly and move on. His political career saved. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is summing up the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Summing up the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Now, historians will tell you that President Andrew Johnson was simply a misfit for the presidency. What do I mean by misfit? There's a couple different definitions, I guess, or analogies of misfit. Some people can be called a misfit because they're a pain in the rear, they don't do anything right, they don't go to class, they don't study, they are a discipline problem in the hair. They're kind of a misfit. That's kind of somebody that's mischievous. But what they mean by misfit here is a person doesn't fit. Now, I might be a good history teacher at Orland High School because they allow me to do to lecture and do it the old-fashioned way. Whereas if I applied for a job in Ten Sleeper, Basin, or Grable, maybe their philosophy is that they want group work. They don't want the lecture series. They want their history teacher to do hands-on stuff. Well, would I be a very good fit for that school? I wouldn't last 5 minutes, okay? And that's what they mean is Andrew Johnson was a misfit for the presidency. And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why, 5 simple reasons, why historians state that Andrew Johnson was a misfit for the presidency. He just didn't fit right with the office. Number 1, President Johnson was a Southerner who did not understand the North. He was a Southerner who did not understand the North. Number 2, President Johnson was a Tennessean who earned the distrust of the South. He was a Tennessean who earned the distrust of the South. What side of the war was Tennessee on? Yeah, and he, remember, was loyal to the Union and spoke against secession from the Union when they spoke about that in Tennessee. So what he was is he was a Tennessean who was not trusted by the South. Number 3, he was a Democrat who was never accepted by the Republicans. He was a Democrat who was never accepted by the Republicans. And number 4, you think about this. He was a president who had never been elected by the people. Did the people vote him to be president? No, he inherited it. They voted him to be what? Vice president. The only reason they voted him to be vice president is because they wanted Lincoln to be president. So he was a president who had not been voted in by the people. And the 5th reason why historians state that Johnson was simply a misfit to the presidency is probably the most prevalent. He was simply the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He just wasn't the right man. He was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He just was a misfit. He should have never been president. Do you think Abraham Lincoln, when he picked him as his vice presidential candidate, 1864, dreamed that he would die and that guy would become president? Absolutely not. He did it because he wanted to kind of balance things out. He wanted a Southern Democrat in there because he's trying to heal the Union. He knew the war was about to be over. He never dreamed the guy could be the president. He wasn't presidential material, by any stretch. But he became the president because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, this Reconstruction program that was first initiated by President Lincoln and then carried on by President Johnson, simply continued to flounder. What does that mean? If something flounders, barely keeping their head above water. I mean, it's just up and down. It's not going very well, okay? So this Reconstruction plan that was initiated by Lincoln and carried on by Johnson continues to flounder. And the task of reconstructing the Union is going to move to another person. And this person is going to be General Ulysses S. Grant, who is going to be elected President of the United States in 1868. So this problem of Reconstruction will now move down to General Ulysses S. Grant, who is going to be elected President of the United States in 1868. Which will take us to our next subtopic, Peyton, which is what? The election of 1868.
Mr. Dirk, guess what?
What?
Ulysses S. Grant died on my birthday.
Did he?
He did.
Well, I'll tell you about the story. Well, you're going to hear some interesting stories about him. Keep that in mind. Now, we'll talk about the election of 1868. And the Republicans really were not looking for someone with great political experience. They were looking for someone that would bring honor back to the presidency. And no man more popular in the country at the time than General Ulysses S. Grant. And as a result of that, the Republicans nominated him, despite the fact that he had absolutely no political experience. They nominate him for president. So, Elisa, how do you solve that problem if you're the Republicans? How are you going to solve the problem, the fact that he doesn't have any experience? When you're considering your vice president, what are you going to do? Pick somebody that has a lot of political experience. And that's what they did. They picked the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Schuyler Colfax, as his running mate. And Schuyler Colfax had lots of political experience. If you're the Speaker of the House, you're the highest ranking